So I think one thing we need to think about is the role of US assets in your portfolios, right? So US Treasuries, for example, a typical traditional safe haven risk-free asset that has kind of been a bit shaky over the last couple of weeks during the volatile periods. So investors are starting to rethink how they allocate to assets like that. Or even the US dollar, right? We've seen one of the weakest first half performance in the US dollar in over 40 years. And again, investors are re-examining how they're thinking about assets like the US dollar, right? So going forward, we believe Asian investors will also have to rethink how they allocate to US markets, right? Does US equity markets still deserve a more than 60+% allocation in portfolio? I think that's worth a think. Should we only be invested in US dollar assets? I think that's also worth considering. Or even US Treasuries, should that be the only risk-free asset in your portfolio? I think investors will probably have to think about that as well. Do you think Asian investors should really totally pivot away from US markets, or how should they deal with it?
I think by what you have described just now, Asian investors have already given an answer. There has been some shift away from the dollar-denominated assets, as you mentioned. But what I want to emphasize here is that that doesn't mean a total abandoning of the dollar and dollar-related assets. Diversification is the only lunch in today's markets. Europe, for example, is taking more heavy weights in terms of investors' asset allocation. Looking back into Asia, quite a few of the economies are pivoting into domestic demand, for example, in view of the rising external volatilities. Japan has been on the path of reflation, and that path looks to be intact because that's driven by a wage growth which comes from a homegrown developments. In China, we also see diversifications or pivoting broadly into domestic demand. Durable goods stimulus has been supporting domestic growth at large over the last few quarters. As property sector stabilizes, we also look into the broadening of the consumption growth in China. We are also looking at some other developments that's related to AI demand, for example, that is driving the the growth in Korea and Taiwan and the broader region who are related to the semiconductor supply chain. And not to forget, in this region, many of the central banks do have a lot of policy rooms because inflation is not a real issue in this area. So quite a few central banks, the likes of Korea, Thailand, do have the policy room to maneuver and cut if necessary.